Okay, deployment. Put your stuff on the internet. Let other people use it. That's pretty much it. So, Marlena, can you read the first objective?
Define and describe deployment.
Fahad, can you read the next one?
Compare and contrast a static file server and dynamic server.
Mr. Adam, can you read this next objective?
Define and describe platform as a service.
Yes. Caroline, can you read this next objective? This is the third time we've seen it. We're actually going to talk about it today. We really are. Jacob, can you read this next one?
Appears on the internet without broken images.
Right, so once we deploy, we can see all the stuff. And Alex, can you read this last one?
All link files match their references case sensitively.
And this kind of plays into how URLs are resolved. Okay, define and describe deployment. So deployment itself is to deploy, like to take your thing and put it somewhere so it's usable by the world. I guess in non-programmer terms, what is synonymous with deploy or deployment? What do you think of? Well, publish? Yeah? So like publish it to the web, Matt?
Getting sent to Afghanistan?
Yeah, so like actual people get deployed in the military when they go from one place to another. They go to the war zone or something like that. Andrew?
Versions?
That's kind of one thing we can talk about. So like you deploy it, but let's say you need to make a bug fix or something like that. You're going to make a new deployment, which is a new version for people to use, definitely. Other things? Cool. There are lots and lots of different ways to deploy. Has anyone here like bought a website like on GoDaddy? Cool. Or like some other website like Bluehosting or something like that. Those types of hosts are known as typically shared hosting websites. They have like some sort of web interface where you can drag and drop your files. You drag and drop them, and then all of a sudden you have a website at that URL, and your files are usable. There are lots of other ways to deploy as well. A virtual private server is you literally get, well, not literally. Let's talk real quick about virtual machines. So a virtual machine is a computer running inside of another computer. So on my machine here, I have a virtual machine that has Windows 7. And so I literally am booting up a Windows machine on my Mac right now. So there are services where they have, like, think of like a data center, like a big, large server rack. And they have this big, beefy server with like 64 gigs of RAM and like 8 cores. And it supports several different virtual environments. Ask me later. Okay. But I'm on a Mac computer, you can see, but I actually have Windows running inside of a window, and I can actually open up Internet Explorer on my Mac. Mac. It's blasphemy!
This is how you get viruses.
But the idea of a virtual machine is it's literally a full-fledged computer running inside of another computer. So there are services where they have this big beefy server, but it's split up into like 100 virtual servers. Yeah. So think of like a really big, beefy, really fast computer, and it has 100 virtual computers inside of it. And the idea is you get your own dedicated virtual computer that is basically a Linux machine. You can run all the commands you run on your Mac on that machine, but you get that server dedicated and you can host your content there. There's also a dedicated server. So rather than splitting up a machine into a bunch of virtual environments, you literally are renting or owning a server on a server rack at a company somewhere. And when I say Linux server, it's literally just a computer where this is pretty much your only interface into it. You can run command, you can log into it remotely. Actually, I'll show you. This is very timely. So this folder name, ntdyl4, not the droids you're looking for, because this is a very secret file in here. This is a file that allows me to connect to a remote server. So if is this going to work? So what I'm doing right now is I'm setting up an SSH session into an EC2 instance, which is a Linux virtual machine running in the cloud. Why is it taking so long? Maybe that's, oh, yeah, that one's broken. I pulled that one down. Yeah, this will work. Or not. Yeah, not good. This one. Cool. Okay, so I just ran that command. Now every command I run right here is running on a remote computer in the cloud. So this is the actual server that's running Galvanize Mastery. Like I could go into that mastery folder. These are all the files that are that application. But these commands I'm running right now, I'm not running them on my machine. I'm actually typing them in and they're being sent to a remote computer. So either if you're using a virtual private server, in this case, this is a virtual private server because it's a Amazon EC2 instance is a virtual machine. But whatever you use, if you get one of those, you can run all the commands you run locally on your machine on that remote machine and push files to it and manage them and stuff like that. So these are like very manual type of services. You're in complete control of the server. You have to run all the commands. You have to run updates, all that kind of stuff. Platform as a service, which is what we're going to be using, hides all of that complexity from you. You literally download a command line tool, you run one command, and now your site is deployed and available to the world. So that's what we're going to be using, and it's fairly easy to get set up. But there are a lot of services that exist like this where they're managing all of the complexity of servers and the memory and the RAM running on the servers and connecting to the servers. They abstract all of that away into like a nice interface on a website or a command line tool where you can just run a command. And then there's also infrastructure as a service. So this is what Amazon Web Services would be considered because I can spin up a virtual machine, but I have more control. They're basically providing infrastructure for companies. Like tons of people use Amazon Web Services and they host all of their content on there, but they're actually manually configuring and managing all the servers that things are running on. So there's lots of different ways to get your things on the internet to make it deployed and available to the world. But these are just some of them. I'm not going to go into like details of all of them, but let's just stare at this list for 10 seconds. Kind of flew past it. But can I get a raise of a hand? What is shared hosting, and what might be a service that is shared hosting? Go ahead.
Yes, it's like one computer shared by so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Putting their websites in this computer.
And can you give an example of a shared hosting host?
GoDaddy.
GoDaddy's one. Is anybody use anything else?
One-on-one.
One-on-one? I use one-on-one. Anything else? Awesome. DreamHost, that's one. Squarespace. Yeah, they might be shared hosting, but also kind of platform as a service because like they have like drag and drop interfaces and stuff like that. But yeah, you're definitely when you host your site there, it's actually the server's being shared with lots of other users. Like you get one specific folder on the server where you put your files, but there are lots of other users being served from that same host. Everyone think about it for a second. What is a virtual private server? Let's try and give it a shot. What is a virtual private server? Jason?
Is that you running the
I think I know where you're going. Try.
you running your the Windows on your computer?
Yeah, so like that's an example of a virtual machine. This takes that and kind of scales it out. Who can add a little bit more to that? Jacob?
It's a server that they partition the drive to have multiple private servers where you can host and you control it.
So it's one physical server with like 100 virtual servers inside of it.
Super beefy.
Super beefy, yeah, and it's insane the what those machines can have. Like I said, like 64 gigs of RAM, like 16 core processors, and they need that much because it's literally emulating or like virtualizing all those operating systems at the same time. Well,
I'm just curious, like on something like that, you can have all of these virtual machines nested, but you have like a larger interface, like enveloping that on a regular computer. Would you have something analogous to that on a virtual private server?
yeah, so the consumer, the person like renting a virtual private server wouldn't get access to that, but the administrators, like the people running that data center, it's called a hypervisor. Basically, it's pretty much a web interface where you can say, okay, I want this virtual machine, it should be allocated this much RAM and this much CPU power, and here is the ISO file of the operating system, install it. But yes, there's literally an interface to manage all of those virtual servers that are inside of it. Kind of a given, but think about it for a second. What is a dedicated server?
Your very own server.
Your very own, right? So you're not sharing it with anyone else. It's not virtual. It is literally a Linux computer, or it could be any other operating system, but it's literally a machine that you can log into, run commands on, but you're running it on that machine. It's not virtual. Andrew?
If I have an old HP that I want to use as a dedicated server, do I have to like basically pay money to kind of have the software to host?
No, so I mean, if you install Linux on it, and if it's old enough, it probably like supports Linux. A lot of the Linux distros can be installed on that. Yeah, you could wipe it, install Linux, and then you could even install Node, and that could serve up a site from it.
The internet allows me to just to like.
So that you have to deal with your internet service provider. Like
Okay.
most ISPs actually block traffic on port 80, so you're not allowed to send outgoing traffic on port 80. But you could use any other port, and the ISP would have no idea that you're hosting a site. And then you can use something called
Cheat the system.
what's that?
Cheat the system.
Basically, and then there's this thing called a domain. What's it called? Domain server that changes the IP when you change. What's it called?
DNS?
It is DNS, but it's
Static.
dynamic DNS.
But if you get a lot of traffic, then the ISP will catch up.
Well, I mean, they'll see, yeah, literally, because anytime somebody visits a website that you would be hosting, that's upload traffic from your internet connection, right? So it's kind of like file sharing, but at the same time, they're like accessing a web server. So dynamic DNS, there's lots of service providers that allow you to do this. Basically, you install an app on your computer because your IP address changes all the time. So your IP address is like the locator of your machine on the internet. It has a unique address that any other computer could contact it using that address. But that changes often, especially like you're going from like one Wi-Fi to another, or every now and then it might change. Everyone stretch. Ooh. Dynamic DNS is a service where they, like when your IP address changes, they keep track of that and then they can give you a domain name. So instead of like the person having to type in your port number to get to your personal server, they can use that dynamic address and still get to your server running at your house without having to type in the port number or something like that. Okay, platform as a service. Think about it for 10 seconds. What is platform as a service? Can I get a volunteer? What is platform as a service? Chase, give it a try.
So is this like basically a company selling you your own private server, without having to like manually go in and do everything? Like is this like Heroku?
Yes, so Heroku is a platform as a service. Today we're going to use Firebase, which is also a platform as a service. One thing you said though is like you get your own virtual server. The idea of a platform as a service is you don't even know what you get. You literally just say, here, host this for me, and they hide all the other complexity. And then infrastructure as a service, instead of hiding complexity, they automate things like I need a new virtual machine or I need a new static file server, and they'll get that up and running for you. So deploying a way of taking the websites that you've built, putting them on the internet somewhere, and making them available to the world. So I want everyone to think for 10 seconds, how would you define and describe deployment? All right, turn to a neighbor and tell them in your own words, what is deployment?
So what is deployment? He just showed us either borrowing that server or just having a server.
So, I have a question about like,
All right, let's bring it back. Relate has a question?
Just about like giving people like a location to find it, but we have the URL, but what about like accessing by IP? That is a thing that we
It's
can
possible,
do.
yeah, definitely. So, yeah, and one thing we haven't talked about is in a URL, we see this in the browser, but when your browser is making that request, it actually is making the request directly to that server's IP address. So what happens before a request happens is your computer will ask a DNS server, domain name server, say, hey, domain name server, what IP address is docs.google.com at? That'll give you back the IP, and then your browser makes the request to that IP. That said, if you know what this IP is, you could replace it, and the request will still work. So let's do this. I think is it NS? Is it lookup? Host. Oh, right now I'm running commands on my remote machine, so that's why my history isn't working. I have a little clue here, so it says mastery, so that I know that that's the host that this is running on. I need to get out of there. Okay, now I'm back on minima, which is my machine. And if I do, I think lookup or
What are some of the good reasons to run something on the other machine?
literally the site can be available to the world. So when you go to mastery.galvanize.network, you're hitting that machine. And that's a server that I'm like renting from Amazon. I pay by the computing hour. They have different like structures for how you pay, but the idea is that server is available to the world, and then I have a domain that is actually pointed at that server. So when you go to mastery.galvanize.network, you're requesting information from that server that I have running.
And then you can go directly and like edit the files directly on the server.
Exactly, and so all of my code is on GitHub. So when I log into the server, I do all my development locally, but when I want to deploy, I'll log in, pull down the latest, and then restart the Node app, and that now has the latest changes that I did.
And that's like what would actually show up. for us.
Exactly. Look up IP. Isn't it like traceroute or host? Berto, do you know the command to look up the IP address for a server? Host is it. Let's do host. Sweet. Okay. So when I do host google.com, I just did a lookup to the DNS server that gave me the address 216.58193.174. If I take this IP address and throw it in my browser, it actually goes to google.com. So when your browser is making that request, it actually is going directly to the IP, but we really just see the domain name itself.
There's also dig, I think, but I forgot how to use that.
Let's see, dig. I can use tldr dig. What is it? Look the IP host associated with the host name. Okay. Dig,
IP
short,
address.
google.com. Yeah, very cool. So who can tell me in their own words, what is deployment? Will.
Taking something that you built and putting it out there on the world so people can see it.
Awesome. Anything else you guys talk about? There's multiple ways to do it, yeah. And that's kind of tie into this next point. Compare and contrast a static file server and a dynamic server. So I have a diagram. So this is a prettier version of the request response cycle that I diagrammed the other day. But in Q1, we're only building static websites, right? We're only using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and building those static files and static sites. So to host the sites that we're building, we're going to use a static file server. So a static file server, literally, you just upload files to it, and it will serve those files back when they are requested. So your browser requests some website, the server is going to respond with index.html. It's going to respond with style.css. It's going to respond with cat.image or .jpeg. Whatever your website is associated with, the static files, meaning all the files that you created on your machine, those are the static files. They're not changing in that once you've created them, they just exist as files. So a static file server, we simply take the files as they exist on our computer, we put them on some other computer, and then when requests are made into that server, it will basically do something like ls, like, is there an index.html file? Yes, there is. I'll send that back when they're requesting slash. Or if they request style.css, it'll do an ls. Is there a style.css file in this folder? Yes, there is. It'll give it back. So the deployment we're going to be doing and the host that we're going to be using is just a static file server. We literally give it some files, and it's going to give those files back. There are other types of servers, and we call those dynamic. So there are actually several different servers that are powering mastery.galvanize.network. When you load this page in your browser, you're hitting the static file server. I'm copying your tab. But when you load this is actually making the request out to Firebase, which is a static file server, and we can look at it, the network tab, as the page loads. So all of these things are, so like vendor.js, app.js, material icons, font file, all of those things are just static files sitting on a Firebase server. So when you load this page in your browser, it's requesting those files and then like rendering them out on the page. A dynamic server is more than just files. It can do a lot more than that. So that's typically what we use node.js for. So when this page loads, the static files are just things like the images, the CSS, the structure of the page. But all of your information, like your names, your scores, all of that stuff is coming from an API. So this is a separate server that just serves up JSON data. And it does that by talking to a database. So if you look on, I think at this diagram. Yeah, this is kind of what's happening. So browser requests and actually it's multiple servers. So it's more like this. So when you, in your browser, visit mastery.galvanize.network, you're being served HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from a static file server. But then when your page requests, okay, give me all the scores for this user, or give me all the notes that you've typed in, that is another request to a separate dynamic server that is talking to a database. So the big difference is this static file server is just giving back files. There's really no logic on the server side. There's nothing, it's not deciding to do anything. It's just literally giving you those files when you ask for them. A dynamic server is talking to a database. It has logic in it that says, okay, if the user is logged in, send them back this data. Okay, if they're not logged in, send them this data. So Q1, we're purely focusing on static file servers, just serving files back. Q2, when we talk more about backend, we're going to be building APIs that are dynamic. Like the data that it gives back changes based on what's in the database or what you're actually requesting. So lots of different types of servers. We're just going to be focusing on static file servers. So what is this? Compare and contrast a static file server and a dynamic file server. I want you to think about it for 30 seconds. How would you compare and contrast a static server and a dynamic server? Maybe what are some characteristics of one versus the other? What is a static file server? Static file server, dynamic file server. All right, turn to a neighbor, compare and contrast a static file server and a dynamic file server.
So static file server just has like the basic, or hosts just basic HTML, CSS, that never actually take the class like if you have a database of users, something logs in, it does a request, asks the database to grab that user, render it. That's
What in this play is
That's all it took.
What's that?
I regret I didn't bring gray yarn to
Oh.
work on a desktop.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Have you made one before?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, slash chess.
All right, let's bring it back. What questions do you have, or maybe what analogies did you come up with? Russ? Yeah.
With the help of online, but static can be seen as like a vending machine.
Okay.
So you have like a box and you have all your food in there, and you basically make a selection and it's already there and it comes back at you. And the
Stop
dynamic is relational to like a restaurant. So you go in and you order something and it's made to order and they have all the ingredients, but it has to like come together and then it's served to you.
I love it. Sean?
Okay, and along the same line as like a kind of simplified, not so much as like, okay, a soda, machine where it's got the cans or the bottles, you get exactly, those things changed. But let's say, you have the ones that where it's just like you press the buttons and you can get like these ones mixed together, like cherry coke, all that mixed together. So.
Definitely, yeah. So like one is you get what you get, the other is you get to choose. And they're like, you best believe there's literally a computer in there like deciding, okay, when he clicks on that, change the servo to go to this pump, and like, yeah, it's dynamic. Go ahead.
So, dynamic servo can be a static servo, but static servo can't be a dynamic servo. Is that-
Oh yeah, that's like I didn't talk about that, but yes. So you can actually set up Node to also be a static file server to just serve up files as well. But what Node does really well is dynamic things, talking to databases, sending back responses. So it is definitely possible that a dynamic server also is serving up static files, but we like to separate them in our minds. And typically, like that's how I deploy things. Like the static portions go to a static server, the dynamic portions on a totally separate server for dynamic. But yeah, you can actually put them in the same server. Other thoughts or things? Caroline?
One thing we were talking about is like static servers would send you kind of the structure of the site and things that you as like the site creator would be modifying like every once in a while, and then the dynamic server would send you things like that the user might change about the site, like our comments or our scores and stuff.
Absolutely. So, and that's kind of, I guess, what's happening with Mastery. So the things that don't change are the HTML, CSS, and really like just the page itself. The things that do change is the data. So like when I click on this page, it loads totally new data to be able to like populate this and be able to click on that. But the site itself is kind of just a shell for all that data that gets loaded in with Ajax.
One question we have on that
Yeah?
though is like, where's the line at map club go kind of like, what if you can add comments or like a guest book or something that those are now gonna load for every user, but originally they were kind of like dynamic. They put it like, would that be still?
It still is dynamic because when the page loads, a request still has to be made to get those latest comments. Or if you're doing server-side rendering, like the server renders the page that has those comments in it. But the moment a new comment is added, you're going to get a new page. Like you're going to get new content. So it's still dynamic.
So on that page right there, where does the database serve information start?
I mean, it depends because like it's based on the app that you build. But for this specific one on this page, the things that are coming from the API are the actual standards themselves. So when I click on this node, this actually came back from an API. This is the standard. So if we look at, I guess collections might be a better thing. So when I load this page, this gives me an array of all collections. When I click on a specific collection, this gives me an array of the standards associated with that collection. And then I make a request to the other API to give me all the standards for each of those standard IDs. And then that populates this. So this was a very simple one. But if we look at like week 3, this collection has all these standard IDs associated with it. So when the page loads, it makes a request out and gets all the data for each of those standards. Stretch. But all of those requests that are happening, that's Ajax. So the page loads, and actually like you'll notice how the fragment is changing. So I click there, it's dashboard. I click there, it's standards. I click there, it's repos, collections. The page never refreshes. Everything is just getting replaced right in the center here using Ajax and a router. It's a single page application, exactly. Yes, and we'll talk about spas eventually. Just because it's a spa doesn't mean it doesn't have multiple pages, right? Because I do have multiple pages. A spa just means that this is kind of like the the place where everything is getting pulled in and out of. And actually, we could probably see it in the DOM tree. Like if I look at main container, and then like click on some other thing, yeah, div and main change. And I click here, everything on the outside of it stays the same, but just this one little div is getting replaced with new contents and new views. Cool, cool. Dynamic versus static. All right. We kind of already talked about platform as a service, but let's see one in action. So Firebase, they actually got acquired by Google a little less than a year ago. They have a lot of different things that you can do. So if you look at features, actually, even if we look at the homepage, they can do a lot of stuff. They have a real-time database. They have authentication as a service, messaging as a service. They have static file storage. They have static hosting. They have a test lab where you can specify your site and it can be tested by like multiple devices and screen sizes. They have places for reporting crashes and all this stuff. They have a lot of services. The one we're going to be using is hosting. So this allows us to host our static files on the web. So you log into Firebase with Google, but once you're logged in, you can go to your console and then create a new project. So I have several projects. So I have one for Galvanized Mastery. That's actually where that thing is hosted. But let's create a new one. Oh no! Actually, I can. Well, it's totally free. That's the other thing I didn't mention. And they have a limit though. I think you can only have like 5 free projects, but I'll do it under this one. Let's look under hosting. So once you create a project, you can click on hosting, and this is where you can actually set up hosting. So the main thing that makes this a platform as a service is this tool. So I install this tool locally, and then now I have commands I can run on my command line to deploy a website. I literally just say Firebase deploy. It puts it on the internet. Or yeah, that's literally the only command we use. But you can run this command, and then Firebase will be totally available on your terminal. So I'm just going to make a basic website. So I'm going to create an index.html. I'm going to create an app.js and a style.css. I am going to create a directory called JavaScripts. And I'm going to move app.js into that folder. Let's open it up and see what we got. So I've got index.html, I've got JavaScripts. Let's create another folder. Let's call it styles. And inside of there, I'm going to put style.css. I'm really just doing this to make the structure of my app a little more complex, because your static site that you deployed can have any number of directories or files inside of it. We'll talk about how those things are actually resolved. So index.html, just a basic page. Hello, deployment. I'll bring in my script tag. So every file that I bring in, whether it's a script or a style file, is in relation to this directory, and it's going to be a relative path. So because I'm in this directory, if I do javascripts/app.js, this is going to load the file that's in the JavaScript folder called app.js. And the idea is everything is relative to where index.html is. So because index.html is like the root of this folder, all other references will be in relation to that. You can also do an absolute path like that, but it's a good idea to keep them relative, because if this folder moves inside of another folder, it'll continue working even if it's deployed somewhere else. So bring in my app, and then I'll bring in my styles/style.css. Let's add some style. So here I'm going to make the body just have a font family of sans serif. And in the JavaScripts, I'm going to log hello, my first deployment. Okay. So one thing I can do and you should do is test your site locally before deploying. So another command you can install, I'll write all this down and put it on the daily plan, but http-server is a way to have a static file server on your machine. So instead of having to deploy every time to see if things are working, you run this static file server and just do your deployment development here, and then when you're ready, you then deploy it. So install HTTP server, and then in any directory that you're inside of, I guess I talked about this at stand down, didn't I? Any directory you're inside of will start a static file server in that specific directory. So if I go to this URL, I'm going to see my website, and if I open up the DevTools, everything is loading, right? So locally on my machine, this is working just fine. I can see the home page, my styles are being loaded, I can see the JavaScripts. Chase.
Quick question.
Yeah.
When you do the HTTP server, every time you close your console, does it close off that server?
I would recommend, yes it will, but you usually want to press Control-C just so you don't have a zombie process. So a zombie process is something that's like sitting in the background that you don't know is there. And then the moment you go to start up another HTTP server, it'll actually be, yeah, so this one won't give you an error. If you try to open up multiple HTTP servers, it just increases the port number. So if I do it again, now on port 8081, I have, well, let's refresh that, yeah. I have the exact same website running, but it's just on 2 different ports.
Is there a way to list those just in case you like forget to do it?
I don't know an easy way. I know you can run a Linux command to say, give me all the processes that have the word HTTP server in them. And then you can find it and kill that ID. But if that happens, talk to me.
Okay.
But yeah, so I killed that other server, and so if I refresh it, it's now gone. Go ahead.
So I have to install HTTP in like in a specific folder, or is it going to be for the whole computer?
For the whole computer. So when you do, you'll do it -G, which is global.
I can install space HTTP space server.
Yeah, actually, I'll keep a note of this over here. So install Firebase tools. You're also going to want to install HTTP server. These commands can be run in any directory.
Dash server?
Yeah.
I did space server installed something.
Probably installed the wrong thing.
Let's take a look.
Yeah, and the idea with this this -G, this installs that command that can be used on your entire machine. But okay, I have this. Do I? Yes, I have a static file server running locally. I can see everything. Everything works just fine. So let's deploy it.
So what I would do -D to destroy that installation.
Look up the npm command to remove a package.
I think it's even funnier juxtaposed with the other pictures.
Like me teaching a lesson.
Well, and the way deployment works is, that's not very Sith-like.
You're right. Okay, so I know that it works locally, so now I'm going to deploy it. So I have that Firebase command installed. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay, I have the Firebase command installed locally, so now I can just type Firebase init. And what this does is it initializes this directory as a Firebase deployment. Hit enter. Okay, it's going to ask me what I want to do. You can do a lot of other things. I am going to uncheck everything except for hosting. Use the spacebar to uncheck it. And actually, we have a repo that walks you through all these commands and tells you how to go through them. So, yes. Before you did this, you should have gone into the console and actually created a project. So you create your project first, then go into the console and init, and now I can choose the project. So for this, I'm going to choose Galvanize, which is that project. Pay attention to these questions. What do you want to use as your public directory? It defaults to the word public. What this is asking is, where should I serve the files from? I want to serve the files in this exact directory, right? I want to serve up this index.html. So my answer to this question is dot, because that means right here in this directory. Configure as a single page application, you can say no. Index.html already exists, overwrite it. Of course not. I did all that hard work with the h1 tag and everything. Do not overwrite it. Okay, we are initialized. What that did was created 2 little files. One of them is Firebase RC, which describes what project you're going to be deploying to, and then firebase.json, which describes where your public directory is. But at this point, I'm all set up and ready to go. I can literally just do Firebase deploy, and it's going to upload my files to the internet. Cool. And now if I go here, I'm on the internet! Woo! Clap, it's great. Anybody click that link, I dare you, click it.
So what about the domain name?
Ah, yeah. So we can probably talk about that at another time. You'll notice that it gave me like galvanized dash some weird characters. If the project name already exists, it's going to do something like that. If you're the first one with that project name, it's going to be thatprojectname.firebaseapp.com. Also, if you get a domain, you can set it up. So in the console, you can go over here and say connect domain and say mycoolsite.com. You would have had to bought that domain on like some other provider, but you'll go through the instructions of setting everything up. They even have HTTPS for free. They just set it up for you, even with a custom domain. So it's pretty sweet. Yeah, and they do have like usage limits. With the basic sites we're building, we're never going to run into those limits. It's like a certain number of megabytes downloaded per month. If you're approaching those limits, it'll let you know.
Does it have upload limits to like if you want to put a ton of images?
Yeah, so they have specifically a storage service. So you would probably want to use that if you have like tons of assets, and then your actual static files go over here. But yeah, it'll let you know too, especially like during this deployment, if you're trying to upload a really large file, it's going to take a very long time. So you would see that. Head?
So is this one better than the exam? Exam?
No, I'm not familiar. What is it?
XAMPP.
Oh, this is like a...
I use PHP for this, so I have...
okay, yeah. So, and the idea here is we don't even know what the server is running. Like, it's literally just a static file server. So XAMPP would require that you actually have a Linux server and that like you're running PHP and stuff like that. This is platform as a service. Like, it's totally hands off. I don't even know what's going on. They're serving my files. That's good enough for me. But platform as a service, that easy to get set up. Anytime I make a new change, I need to redeploy. So let's pull up HTTP server so I can do some development. I'll come back in here and add some cool new features like a footer that says, can I add like the copyright? Copy. So my Sith name is Darth Carmel because Carmen's my actual name. Yeah, okay, there we go, copyright. So now that I have made changes, I need to redeploy. So if I go in here, kill this server, and run Firebase deploy, that's going to take my latest changes, push them back up to the interwebs. And so now, if you click on my link, notice how it's not there. It's cached. Your browser cached the old version of the website. If you press Command-Shift-R, that does a hard refresh and requests the files brand new from the server. And so now we can...
The local storage you showed us in the dev tools?
Not local storage, just the cache. And actually, another way to get around that is if you click on the network tab and say disable cache, it won't cache anything. So let's make a new change, deploy it, and see if that actually works. So let's add a p tag. May the 4th be with you. Of course, I want to test it locally before deploying. A lot of students will get in the habit of like, make a change, deploy, make a change, deploy. That takes a long time, and you're going to be sitting there like watching the upload happen all the time. So make sure you're testing your site locally before you do deploy it. So now locally, may the 4th be with you, looks good to me. So let's kill this, Firebase deploy. And now, when I request this, because I have disable cache checked, we should get the latest version without the cache.
I think that only works if you have the dev user.
Yes. So if this is closed, it's not going to work. And that's to your benefit, because if you had that open on every single website, every website now is going to take a really long time to load because it's not actually caching anything. So make sure that's open and that's checked. This is platform as a service. This is how easy deployment can be. So what I want you to do, where are we at? Let's see where we're at on objectives. Got that. App appears with no broken links. Got that. All linked files match their references, case sensitivity. So let's talk about that. So notice style.css is lowercase. But what happens if I change this to uppercase? And
It's not case sensitive.
it is, or should be. I guess not. Let's look at the network. This specific server probably isn't case sensitive. So Yeah, it's requesting style and it's getting it back. A lot of servers are case sensitive. So you're going to want to make sure that all files names are exactly the way they are described there. The other thing is making sure that these paths line up with the current directory that you're in. So if I did like something here, like this is totally going to break because this path doesn't even exist, right? Where are we at? Now the styles are gone.
I mean, that's breaking, like, that doesn't have anything to do with Firebase if you mess up case sensitivity or file paths. You're
It's-
just breaking it.
Yeah,
already.
it's on you basically. Like you have put a request to a file that like doesn't actually exist, and so the thing won't actually load. So if I had images in here, let's do that. Create a new folder called images, and then inside of there, I think I have some images somewhere. Oh yeah, want to see pictures of young CJ? Oh. Yeah, punk rocker. Okay, let's put that on the internet. Okay, and let's rename it. So, what's that?
Was that prom?
It was the Mardi Gras ball. I'm from Louisiana. Let's call this hardcore. Okay, so I wanna put an image tag. I can throw the source in there. I can do images/hardcore.jpg. But let's say I spelled images wrong. You'll actually see this even on the local file server. You see this little broken image link, right? That basically means it made the request, and you can actually see it in the console, not found, because I spelled that wrong. So if I go back and spell it right, the image will show up. Cool. And let's put it on the internet. So that's good. One thing I'm not showing is you should be git committing like pretty much every time before you deploy. Do something like, well, let's initialize this. Actually, I'll just say. So this is an alias I have, git commit with a message. Deploying. So like pretty much every time you deploy, create a commit. So if you ever need to roll back to a previous deploy that was working, you can do that. So now I have a commit, and then let's Firebase deploy.
So otherwise, like, it'll just override.
Yeah, and it's really just for your own benefit, just so that you like. Let's say you deploy and something breaks. You're like, oh, let's roll back and see what changed. See why did it break? And now if we go here, yeah. Wait, am I like zoomed in? Yeah, I'm way zoomed in. Cool. So spell your file names right. Make sure all the paths are correct. Test your things locally before deploying. And by inference, we kind of covered this one. So like I said, every request is relative to the document that's being requested. So here, this is relative to index.html, so it's just images slash or JavaScript slash. And that's how the files are going to be resolved. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions, comments, clarifications about deploying in Firebase, platform as a service? Rob? No? I think I have some more on the internet. Oh, I literally moved it. So this is me. Fifth place regionals in Oklahoma.
What weight class?
I think 40 pounds.
That's freestyle.
Yeah. No, like we were literally the only people that competed. So, and then this guy just literally laid there. So. Oh yeah, and then this was our server rack for Capture the Flag event in college. I was the team lead. We had 3 servers that we had to keep up and running: a Linux server, a Windows server, and then like a rogue server. But the way we did it was we did a hypervisor on both of these, and they're basically like a redundant backup. So this, like the top server was running both Windows and Linux, and the other one was a duplicate. So if anything ever happened, we could just spin those back up. We actually lost, but it was fun.
What's on your shirts?
It was called Cyber something. It's like the logo for the event. It's like really poor graphic design and like cheaply printed T-shirts. But
Was that before or after you lost that picture
Which one? Oh, this was after we lost. Yeah.
Changes the context.
Yeah, totally. I just realized I'm still screen recording. That's
Cool.
yeah. That's all I have. Thank you all very much.